Hi guys, this is Nia and today I have a tutorial on how to paint a Sansevieria or snake plant. So let's begin by drawing it out first. Snake plants are so simple to draw. It's just basically a very long leaf, but they are quite rigid and stiff compared to normal leaves, but it's still easy to achieve by just adding larger curves for leaves which are facing forward. Another thing that I like to add are twists and folds, which make these leaves look very organic. You can just take some of the sides in or create full twists and create different varieties. If this is a bit hard to imagine, you can also cut out a shape of a leaf with a piece of paper and twist it around to help you visualize them. I would suggest for you to draw out simple twists and folds first, and once you get used to it, you can start getting into the more difficult folds, but just work at your own capacity because these are not exactly necessary. It's just a bit of fun. Another thing you can also do is to add bends. Though these leaves are rigid and grow straight up, sometimes the weight can pull them down, especially around the sides, so you can just bend them slightly towards the top. I'm going to be painting the Sansevieria in a planter, and I also want to put other ceramic pots as accents. So like any other pots, I just like to start with an oval at the top with lines going down from the sides and the bottom to have similar curvature to the oval. For this, I also want to give the planter a wooden stand to give it some height. The thickness of the oval depends on where your point of view is. The more circular, the higher the point of view, and the flatter, the more front-on view you have. You can actually create in different types of pots or even vases for this, but I'm just going to keep this one simple for the painting. So I'm just going to first sketch out the basic shapes of the planters and also the leaves to help me as guide. But before I painted this, I also decided to fix the angle of the pot for it to have more of a side view, and I also made it slightly thinner. Just remember though that you can create your own fun planters if you would like, or even just paint leaves by itself because it's quite fun to actually just repeatedly paint the pattern in different angles and folds once you get used to it. This is an example of the painting I did as I was trying to figure out the easiest steps of painting the leaves. So pick a composition that you like. You may also have several of these plants in different pots, which are also fun to paint. So here are the colors that I'm going to be using for the leaves first, since that's going to be our main subject. I have here white, lemon yellow, yellow ochre, sepia, terra verde, and hooker's green. They're all by Holbein except for the hooker's green, which is by Cotman. So with this, let's get straight to painting. I'm going to start by making the base color of the plant, and for that I'm going to mix in lemon yellow, white, and yellow ochre with the tiniest bit of hooker's green and sepia. And I'm going to just pick a leaf to fill, and while that paint is still wet, I added more yellow ochre to a portion of the yellow mix, and I just dot them around the sides to give a bit of variation in color, and this will just be a subtle color change as the paint will slowly blend once it dries off. I like to paint this in 2s or 3s depending on how large the area is. This will also help me to see single leaves because of all the lines from the folds and layers of the leaves. It might be a little bit difficult to see if you paint them all at once. I also try to paint the single leaves which are not touching each other to avoid the colors from bleeding. And if the leaf that you're painting have folds, I also like to separate them while painting. So I would just go back to it once I finish all of the steps for the leaf, then do the same for the folds once that part of the leaf is dry. Once the yellow base is completely dry, I'm going to place the next layer, which is a mix of terra verde, white, and a bit of sepia, and I'm going to paint it in the middle of the leaves while leaving the side with the yellow, and I'm going to work on this with a medium consistency that is not too watery because I want to add on the next color too, which is a mix of hooker's green and sepia in a thick consistency. And I'm going to first apply this to paint one leaf at a time. I want the dark green mix to be very thick with barely any water so the paint doesn't run. To paint this, I like to make very thin lines with the tip of my brush, and while doing this, I also want the pattern to roughly run horizontally across the leaf, so the angle will change slightly depending on where the leaf is leaning towards. It's also nice to add some random curvatures to the pattern, which can guide your eyes to the contour of the leaf, which then adds the illusion of movement to the object. When the leaves that you're painting has folds covering up the yellow part, just be aware that means that the green would touch the side like this particular one. I'm going to show you an example through drawing which might be a bit more clear to see without so many lines. So the front and the back side of the leaf has practically the same pattern, so when you twist depending on how much, you are able to also see a pattern on the back side of the leaf as well. I think it helps to understand which sides you're painting. However, if it's hard to visualize, again, you can just cut out a leaf shape in a piece of paper and this time draw out the lines and patterns on each side, then twist it around to use as reference. For this first batch, I'm going to show you how to paint the pattern on a wet surface, which gives a slightly blurry effect, which might look more dynamic, but I'm also going to show you how I paint it on a dry surface later on. You can just go about both ways, but I think if you're a true beginner, the wet on dry technique is probably a bit easier because there's a bit of control involved in painting wet on wet. Like for this one specifically, you don't want every surface to be overly wet. I just want it to be slightly cold to the touch or a bit damp. And while applying the pattern, I also barely touch the page with my brush because the paint will travel so quickly, especially if you're only wanting to paint such a tiny space. After I've painted the pattern, I also soften some of the edges by using a clean dry brush and moving some of the wet paint ever so slightly so I don't disrupt it too much. And once that side of the leaf is dry, I'm going to go ahead and paint the sides. It's very important that the first side is completely dry or else you might risk the paint bleeding. And I'm just going to paint the back side the same way but with a bit less detail because the space is smaller. I find that this wet on wet technique look better because there's more uncontrolled pattern that is special to watercolors, but as it dries, it may also dry a bit lighter than when it was wet, so I actually like to layer on a bit more dark green after this dries, and through the layers I think that it creates a much more complex looking pattern. So while those two dries off, I'm going to move on to the next batch and I'm going to paint using the wet on dry technique for the pattern this time. For the base, I'm just going to paint it as before with the lemon yellow mix and also the yellow ochre dots. And then for the next layer, I'm going to be using the terra verde mix like before. So now that the green base is mostly dry, I'm going to use the dark green mix from before, which is a mixture of hooker's green and sepia. And you will see here that as I paint on the green, the paint doesn't spread much at all because now the paint is just sitting on top of the dry paper instead of getting absorbed and mixed with the base. You can also see that this way you also have more contrast between the base and the dark green mix, but we can still soften this by using a clean damp brush and smudging some of the edges delicately. As you can see here, in contrast to what I just painted, the first batch of leaf is now dry and are looking quite dull, so I'm going to build up on some of the darker green to add a bit more complexity to the pattern as well as increasing the intensity of colors. For this particular fold here, because it is fairly large, I'm going to give it the same amount of detail as the rest of the larger leaves. But for the smaller folds, I tend to paint with a bit less detail due to the small space. Once you've painted all of your leaves, I'm then going to separate some of the lines by adding a slight outline as well as shadows to separate some of the leaf shapes using a mixture of yellow ochre and sepia. I like to add small amounts of shadows behind folds as well as the bottom part of the plant where there are layers of them. I'm only doing this subtly, but you can also add as much shadows as you would like to. Then with the same mixture but with more sepia, I'm going to paint some of the soil which are visible on the sides. Here I decided to make the wooden stand a bit thinner, so I just redrew it, but this depends on the type of planter you decide to paint. I just think that a thinner line would make it look more elegant. I'm going to first paint the main planter, and for this I want it to just be slightly gray or white, so I decided to mix some ivory black with some white and paint it at a very thin consistency all around the pot except for the rim. Then when the surface is still wet, I added a slightly darker tone just to dot around the edges to indicate a bit of shadow. This will still be subtle, but I'm going to add on to it later after it dries. I'm going to move on to the planter on the right, and at this point I didn't really know what I was going to paint yet, but I was just thinking of ceramic pots. So I added some burnt sienna to the gray mix and see what I have, and just started painting lines across the planter following the contour horizontally. Then I thought about those melted glazes that are used to sometimes decorate the pots with the paint slightly dripping down. I'm not sure what the technical term is, but I just basically added a bit of cerulean blue to the mix. Then I decided from there that I want the top half of the pot to be blue and the bottom to be brown, but I want them looking quite rustic, so I'm just going to mix the color slightly so the blue doesn't become too overwhelmingly bright. For the inside of the pot, I just used whatever color was on my palette since those are the colors that I used for the pot anyway. Then I also decided to add a bit of cerulean blue at the top so it's consistent all across. Using a thicker consistency of the cerulean blue mix, with the blue being the dominant color, I added drips all across the rim, but I left out all of the white negative lines still so the side still has a curvy texture. Then for the deepest area, I added a bit of sepia to darken the gray mix, so that part looks like it's in shadow and it's a bit darker than the rest. And to give a slight outline, I just used a bit of ivory black mixed with the cerulean blue, but I'm just going to do this very subtly. I also decided to add upside down drips from the bottom of the pot, and for that I used a mixture of sepia and burnt sienna, and I'm just going to apply it the same way as I did for the top. Then for the bottom, I used the same gray as the main color of the pot. I'm going to use the same dark brown color to paint the wooden stand, but you can also opt for a lighter brown if you would like to. I just find that I like the contrast a bit more, and using whatever was left of my brush, I lined the rim of the previous pot. Because the inside of this pot is now dry, I decided to add the drips the same way as I did before for the front face. At this point, I haven't really decided what I want the pot to look like, but I see that there's a lot of brown mix from before, and being the stingy person that I am and trying to reduce wasting my paints, I decided to just add a bit of cadmium orange to lighten the color slightly, and then I just used it to paint the whole pot with it. As I paint, I want some parts to be darker than the rest. I also used a little bit of dry brush technique to leave out some white negative space. Then while the paint is still wet, I also added a darker brown, especially around the sides and the inside of the pot. I also used a really dark brown for the bottom. As I paint the inside though, and the rest of the paint is still quite wet, I just left out a very thin line across the oval so the paint doesn't bleed into each other because it might end up looking flat. Moving back to the planter behind it, because it's now completely dry, I decided to add a thin consistency of the same color and used it to paint the lines on the surface for the inside of the pots. And then using the same brown, I decided to paint some vertical lines for this one, and I'm also going to use the darker tone of brown to slightly outline the pot. I'm going back to the main planter and I want to add a bit of shadow, so I used the same gray as before, but this time I also added a touch of cerulean blue to create a cooler gray, and I paint the shadow very loosely so I can see a lot of texture. Then I'm going to use a thicker consistency of the same color and outline it like the rest of the pots. Using the same cool gray, I'm going to finish everything off by painting the cast shadow under the planters, and I want to start with a light to medium consistency, then slowly building on to a slightly thicker consistency where the shadow is closest to the planters. And that's basically it. We're finally finished with this illustration. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I didn't realize that the Sansevieria was going to be so much fun to paint, and I hope you guys also enjoy painting them if you decide to give this one a go. Like usual, all of the tools and social media links are going to be listed in the description box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!